My landlord raised my rent to force me out. I smiled and signed the new lease. He didn't know I'd just bought the building. The envelope was cream-colored, thick stock, the kind of paper that announces itself. I recognized Stellendrecht's handwriting before I even flipped it over. Blocky, overconfident capitals like everything else about him. I was standing in the hallway of my own apartment in a bathrobe at 7:14 in the morning, coffee going cold in my hand, and I read the number on that letter 3 times before my brain would accept it. $4,200 a month. I'd been paying $2,200. I laughed, out loud, by myself, in the hallway. The kind of laugh that starts somewhere below your ribs and doesn't have anything to do with anything being funny. Because here's what Stellendrecht did not know, could not have known, had no conceivable way of knowing. 4 days earlier, at 3:18 p.m. on a Tuesday, I had signed the closing documents on the purchase of 4114 Varnish Street, the building I was standing in, wearing that bathrobe, holding that letter. Every unit, every hallway, the boiler room in the basement, the crumbling section of driveway he'd been promising to fix for 3 years. All of it, mine. And now my new landlord, me, was staring at a letter from my old landlord, him, demanding I pay nearly double my rent in 30 days or vacate the premises. I folded the letter back into the envelope. I set it on the kitchen counter next to my coffee. I finished getting dressed. Then I called my attorney and told her we needed to talk. I'd lived at 4114 Varnish Street for 6 years by the time any of this happened. I moved in when I was 29, fresh out of a bad situation with a business partner that had cost me 2 years and most of my savings. The apartment was nothing special. Second floor, unit 2C, north-facing windows that made the whole place feel like the inside of a cloud 9 months out of the year. But the rent was reasonable. The commute was 20 minutes on the subway, and I was tired of making decisions. I needed somewhere to just be for a while. My name is Corvus Hale. People either love that name or they immediately ask if I'm joking. I've answered that question enough times that I've stopped registering it. I work in commercial real estate analytics. Not as an agent, I've never held a license, but on the data side. I build models that help investment firms evaluate acquisition targets, occupancy trends, rent roll analysis, cap rate projections, neighborhood trajectory scoring. I'm good at it. I've gotten better at it every year. By year 4 at Varnish Street, I was pulling enough to have savings again, real savings, and I'd started quietly learning the acquisition side of the business. Stellendrecht, I met on move-in day. He was 50-ish, with the permanently sunburned complexion of a man who played golf in bad hats, and he had a handshake that lasted about 2 seconds too long, the kind where the other person is asserting something. He owned the building through an LLC called Drecht Property Solutions, which consisted, as far as I could tell, of Stellan and a part-time bookkeeper named Marvella, who answered the phone with audible reluctance. He was not a bad landlord in the active, predatory sense. He was a bad landlord in the lazy, negligent sense, which in some ways is worse because there's no malice to reason with. The hallway lights went out for 6 weeks in 2021, and I had to send 4 emails before anyone came. The boiler made a sound every February that the building's maintenance guy, Oswin Price, described as expressing itself, which was not reassuring. When I asked Stellan directly about the driveway crack that had been widening since 2022, he told me the building was structurally sound, which wasn't what I asked. But the rent was stable and the location was good, and I had other things to think about. The first real sign that something had shifted came 8 months before the letter. I ran into Stellan in the lobby, unusual because he rarely came by, and he was with a man I didn't recognize, younger, in a very good suit, carrying a leather document folio. They went into the basement for about 40 minutes. Stellan looked, I thought, slightly ill. I noted it and moved on. The second sign came 2 months later, when Marvella called to ask if I'd be open to a conversation about my tenancy. I said sure. She said Stellan would be in touch. He wasn't. I let that go too. The third sign was Oswin. We'd developed a friendship of sorts over the years, the kind built on nodding in hallways and occasionally commiserating about the boiler. In December, 6 months before the letter, he told me over the course of a rambling 15-minute conversation in the parking area that Stellan had been talking to money people, that the building had problems Stellan can't afford to fix, that he, Oswin, wasn't sure how much longer he'd have a job. And then, like a switch flipping in my head, I started paying a different kind of attention. I want to be clear about something. I didn't set out to buy the building. That's not how this started. What I did, initially, was what I always do. I pulled the data. 4114 Varnish Street is a 12-unit mixed-use building. 4 of those units commercial on the ground floor. Built in 1961, last major renovation 2004. Assessed at $2. $1 million in the last tax cycle, which my professional instinct immediately flagged as undervalued given the neighborhood trajectory over the past 4 years. A light rail expansion had opened 6 blocks north in 2023. A grocery anchor had moved into the next street over. The commercial vacancy rate in the quarter-mile radius had dropped from 18% to 6% in 24 months. The building, in other words, was worth significantly more than Stellendrecht apparently understood. I ran the rent roll on what I knew, my unit, and what I could infer from conversations with neighbors. Fenwick Ola in 1A had mentioned his rent in passing during a building meeting about the mailbox situation. Giselle Tram in 3B had complained about hers to anyone who'd listened for 2 years. From those data points and the building's square footage, I estimated Stellan was grossing somewhere between $24,000 and $28,000 a month on residential, with an additional $8,000 from the commercial leases. That was approximately $384,000 annually in gross revenue, before expenses. For a building with a boiler that expressed itself and a crumbling driveway and deferred maintenance that Oswin had described as significant, Stellan's operating costs were probably eating 40 to 45% of that. Call it $170,000 a year in NOI. At a 6.5% cap rate, conservative for this corridor, the building's market value was roughly $2.6 million. The assessed value was $2.1 million. There was a gap there, a meaningful one. I contacted my attorney, Philippa Strand, who has spent 20 years in commercial real estate law and has the particular energy of someone who has seen every possible way a deal can go sideways and has genuinely stopped being surprised by any of it. I told her I wanted to research the ownership structure and any debt encumbrances on 4114 Varnish Street. She pulled the public records. What she found was this: Direct Property Solutions, LLC, had a first mortgage on the building with Crestline Mutual Savings, taken out in 2009, with a balloon payment due in 14 months. The balance was $980,000. The balloon was $980,000. There was also a second lien from a private lender, an LLC called Fargate Capital, which Philippa said she'd seen before and didn't like the structure of, for $340,000, filed 18 months ago. Total debt, $132 million. Building value, approximately $2.6 million. Equity, approximately $1.28 million. But here was the problem for Stellan. The balloon payment was in 14 months. The deferred maintenance was likely going to trigger an appraisal issue with any refinancing lender, and Fargate Capital, I had Philippa dig deeper, had a history of inserting aggressive default clauses in their private loans. The young man in the good suit, I now understood, had been an agent for Fargate, checking on their collateral. Stellan Drecht was not a predatory landlord. He was a panicking one, which made him, from my perspective, a motivated seller. I want to be specific about the sequence here, because the sequence matters. In February, I had the data. In March, I had Philippa structure an approach. In April, I had a broker, a man named Dashiell Okonkwo, 15 years in mid-market commercial acquisitions, the kind of negotiator who speaks slowly on purpose, make a quiet, off-market inquiry to Direct Property Solutions about their interest in a potential sale. Stellan said no, through Marvella, without a counteroffer. In May, Fargate Capital sent what Philippa confirmed was a formal notice of technical default related to a missed insurance escrow payment. This was a pressure mechanism more than a genuine default. Fargate wanted Stellan to know they could call the loan if they chose to. It's a negotiating tactic. It's also, Philippa noted, occasionally the precursor to an actual call. In May, Dashiell made a second inquiry. He presented a number, $2, $45 million, all cash, 30-day close. Below market, yes, but certainty has value. No financing contingency, no inspection circus, no months of back and forth. Stellan said he'd think about it. In June, Crestline Mutual Savings sent their own letter, this one noting that the upcoming balloon payment would require a full appraisal and potentially additional collateral given evolving loan-to-value assessments. I know this because Oswin told me he'd seen the envelope. He recognized the bank's return address because he'd handled Stellan's mail during a family emergency 2 years back and had a long memory for details. On June 14th, Dashiell got a call back. Stellan's attorney, a man named Pruitt Galbraith, solo practice, who Philippa described as technically capable but not equipped for this particular conversation, wanted to discuss terms. On June 28th, we countered at $2, $52 million with a 60-day close to give them more time to unwind their affairs. On July 9th, Stellan Drecht accepted. I was sitting in my apartment in Unit 2C when Philippa called to tell me. The north-facing windows were doing their cloud impression. I remember looking around the room, the scuff on the baseboard I'd always meant to fix, the window latch that never quite caught, the specific creak of the floorboard near the kitchen entry, and feeling something I didn't have a clean word for. The closing was July 22nd. Crestline got paid off. Fargate got paid off. Stellan Drecht walked away with approximately $1.18 million in equity, after all encumbrances, broker fees, and closing costs. Dashiell called it a fair outcome. Philippa called it a clean close. I called it the start of something. The deed transferred at 3:18 p.m. on a Tuesday. Stellan's formal notice to me, rent increase effective 60 days from receipt, from $2,200 to $4,200, arrived 4 days later. He had drafted it before the closing. He had been planning it. The envelope was already stamped. I held it in my hands and thought, he prepared this. He sat down and wrote my name on it and thought, this will do it. This will get rid of him. I thought, he has no idea. I called Philippa at 8:45 that morning, still in my work clothes, the cream-colored envelope on the counter. He sent a rent increase notice, I said. There was a pause on her end and then a sound I'd describe as professionally contained amusement. How much? $4,200. Another pause. What would you like to do? I'd been thinking about that in the 20 minutes since I'd read the letter. There were several options. I could do nothing. I was the landlord. The notice had no legal effect. It was functionally meaningless. I could respond through Philippa immediately, which would be efficient but would lose something in the translation. Or I could do what I actually did. I'm going to respond in writing, I said. Can you draft a cover letter for me to attach with the new lease? Something that establishes the change in ownership, notes the proper notice requirements, and makes clear that all future communications should go to our management entity. I can have that to you by end of day, Philippa said. Also, I said, I want to include a corrected rent figure. Corrected to what? $2,200, I said. Same as it's been. He doesn't get to send a rent increase notice from a position he no longer holds. This time, the pause was longer. Corvus, she said, with a warmth that was fairly unusual for her. I'm going to enjoy drafting this letter. The document she sent me at 4:47 p.m. was 3 pages, clean and precise on the letterhead of my management entity, which I'd already registered as Varnish Street Holdings, LLC. It referenced the recorded deed, the date of transfer, and the complete inapplicability of any notice issued by prior ownership post-close. It included a formal introduction of myself as the property owner, noted my current tenancy in Unit 2C, and attached a corrected lease for the following term at the existing rate of $2,200 per month. At the bottom, at my request, Philippa had added a single additional line. Mr. Hale looks forward to being a good neighbor. I printed the packet, put it in an envelope, and walked downstairs to the mailbox for Unit 3D, Stellan Drecht's mailing address on file. He didn't live in the building. He'd just kept the address for correspondence because it was convenient. I slid the envelope in. I went back upstairs and made dinner. He called the next morning at 9:02 a.m. The number was his cell, which I had because it was on every piece of building correspondence for 6 years. I let it ring. He called again at 9:17, then at 9:41. Then there was a voicemail, which I didn't listen to until Philippa had been briefed, because I had a feeling it was the kind of voicemail you want a lawyer to hear in real time. It was. He was not composed. The substance of the voicemail paraphrased, there had been some kind of mistake. The letter I'd sent was legally invalid. He still owned the building. I should stop what I was doing immediately, and he was going to have his attorney contact me. Pruitt Galbraith called Philippa at 11:15 a.m. I was on a work call and couldn't hear the conversation directly, but Philippa's summary afterward was precise. Galbraith had initially presented with confidence, suggested there might be a procedural issue with the deed transfer, and asked for an extension of time to review documentation. Philippa had read him the deed recording number, the date, the timestamp, and the name of the county recorder who'd processed it. She had also noted gently that Stellan Drecht had been represented by counsel throughout the transaction, and that Galbraith himself had signed off on the seller's closing documents. Galbraith had gone quiet for a period she described as around 15 seconds, which is a long time on a phone call. Then he'd said he'd need to consult with his client. By the following Monday, I had received no further communication from Stellan directly. What I had received was a visit from my neighbor, Fenwick Ola, in 1A, who knocked on my door at 7 p.m. with a look on his face like he was either going to laugh or have a medical event. Is it true? He asked. Is what true? He held up his phone. Stellan, apparently, had sent a mass email to the building's tenant list, a list he still had from his time as owner, claiming that there had been an unauthorized transfer of the property, and that tenants should disregard any communications from a party claiming to be the new owner. He had written, verbatim, "Your leases remain valid under existing ownership. Do not be alarmed." I stood in the doorway and read it 3 times. He sent this to everyone? I said. Everyone, Fenwick confirmed. Giselle is furious. She called me 3 times. What did you tell her? I told her I'd go ask the actual owner. He looked at me steadily. So, is it true? Yes, I said. It's true. He nodded slowly, processing this. He'd lived in 1A for 9 years. He paid $1,950 a month. He'd had 4 separate requests for maintenance ignored by Stellan's office in the past 18 months. The boiler, he said. The driveway. All of it. All of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put out his hand. I shook it. I want to be fair to Stellan Drecht in this section, in the same way you can be fair to a man who set fire to his own boat and is now complaining that his shoes are wet. He hired a second attorney, not Galbraith, a firm out of the city, Homestead and Pari, who did have some real estate litigators on staff. They sent Philippa a letter asserting, with impressive creativity, that the sale had been conducted under informational asymmetry that constituted a form of constructive fraud, in that I, the buyer, had possessed knowledge of the building's financial situation by virtue of being a tenant and had leveraged that knowledge unfairly. Philippa's response ran 11 pages. I read every word. It was, to put it plainly, devastating. It established that the information I'd used, the mortgage balance, the Fargate lien, the balloon payment date, was entirely public record, accessible to any party who chose to look. It noted that Stellan had been represented by counsel throughout the transaction. It included a copy of the arm's-length disclosure, signed by both parties at closing. It referenced 2 federal circuit court decisions and a relevant state appellate ruling from 2019. It closed with a paragraph noting that should Homestead and Pere choose to file any action on this theory, Varnish Street Holdings LLC would seek sanctions under Rule 11 for frivolous litigation. We never heard from Homestead and Pere again. What we did hear, approximately 3 weeks after the closing, was from a reporter. Her name was Tessa Vane Vaincroft, and she covered real estate and housing for the city's main daily. She had somehow gotten wind of the situation. I have a suspicion Giselle in 3B had something to do with this, as Giselle had described herself to me once as constitutionally unable to not tell people things, and she called Philippa's office asking for comment. Philippa called me. "There's a reporter," she said. "I know," I said, because I'd already had a message from Giselle that read, "In its entirety, I may have talked to someone. She seems nice. You should talk to her." I thought about it for about 2 hours. Then I called Tessa Vaincroft. She was sharp, careful, and had clearly done her research before picking up the phone. She'd already pulled the deed, the prior ownership history, the Fargate lien, and Stellan's mass email to the tenants, which, she noted, could be characterized as an attempt to mislead current tenants about the legal status of their leases. "Could be characterized how?" I asked. "As potentially actionable," she said, "depending on whether anyone took action based on it." I mentioned that 2 tenants had told me they'd withheld their rent payments that month because they weren't sure who to pay. Fenwick Ola and a woman in 2A named Orinthia Belka, who'd lived there 4 years and had the particular anxiety of someone who'd been evicted once before and never fully recovered from it. Tessa was quiet for a moment. "Would Ms. Belka speak with me?" Orinthia, as it turned out, would speak with her for 45 minutes. The article ran on a Thursday. The headline was measured, something about a tenant-turned-owner in a below-market acquisition, but the details told the story clearly enough. It included a summary of the deferred maintenance issues, the tenant confusion caused by Stellan's email, and a quote from Orinthia that I have thought about many times since. "I didn't sleep for 4 nights because I thought I was going to lose my home. And the whole time, the person who owned it was 2 floors up." That landed harder than anything else in the piece. Stellan Drecht did not respond to Tessa's requests for comment. Pruitt Galbraith issued a 2-sentence statement saying the sale had been conducted in good faith by all parties, a remarkable pivot from the constructive fraud theory of 6 weeks prior. This is the part I want to be careful with, because it's easy for a story like this to become about a single satisfying moment and miss what came after. I hired Oswin Price as my full-time property manager. He accepted before I finished the sentence. He'd worked for Stellan for 11 years and had a list, an actual written list I found out later, kept in a folded piece of notebook paper in his jacket pocket, of every maintenance issue he'd flagged and been told to defer. The list had 22 items. The boiler was number 3. The driveway was number 7. I brought in a contractor named Bergstrom and Associates that Daschle recommended, who did a full property assessment in the first month. Total deferred maintenance estimate, $218,000. Not catastrophic for a building this size. Manageable. Oswin had kept the critical systems functional through sheer will and ingenuity, and that had bought us time. I held a tenant meeting in the lobby. All 12 units showed up, which, as Fenwick later told me, had never happened once in 9 years. I stood in front of the mailboxes, the ones with the broken latch on box 7 that Oswin had been asking about for 2 years, and I told them what I owned, what I intended to do with it, and what wouldn't change. The rents wouldn't change. Not this year. I was more interested in occupancy stability and building health than in squeezing margin from people who'd been here longer than most of the problems. The commercial leases I would renegotiate at fair market, because the ground floor tenants, a dry cleaner, a printing shop, a physical therapist's office, and a vacancy that had been empty for 8 months, represented real upside, and that's where I'd find the cash flow to fund the maintenance backlog. Orinthia Belke started crying, which she immediately apologized for. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. Giselle Tram said, "What about the hallway lights?" "Oswin," I said, "when can we fix the hallway lights?" Oswin checked his phone. "I ordered the parts last week, Friday." Giselle looked at him, then at me. Then she sat down. "There's one thing I haven't told you yet, and it's the thing I think about when I'm in the building late, after Oswin has gone home and the hallways are quiet and the boiler is doing its thing in the basement. The morning after I received Stellan's letter, that cream-colored envelope, that absurd number, I went down to check the mail and ran into him in the lobby. He was there to put notices under doors. He didn't know I'd seen his letter yet. He nodded at me with the slightly stiff pleasantness of a man who considers himself your superior in the particular context of this lobby. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I said. He had a stack of envelopes. I could see the edges of them, the same cream stock. He was going door to door with them. "Everything okay with the building?" I asked. He smiled. The smile of a man who has decided something and is enjoying the privacy of it. "Making some changes," he said. "You'll be hearing from us." I nodded. I went to check my mail. I listened to his footsteps going down the hall. He didn't know. He stood in the building I owned and told me I'd be hearing from him, and he didn't know. I thought about that for a long time. Not with triumph exactly, with something closer to wonder, at the gap that can exist between what someone believes is true and what simply is. He'd built a story in his head. Pressure this tenant out, clean up the rent roll, refinance with the improved numbers, survive. It was a plan. It had a logic. He'd acted on it. He just hadn't checked the county recorder's office. The driveway is fixed. Has been since October. The boiler, and I want to be specific about this because Oswin deserves the credit. The boiler was fully serviced in August, 2 new components replaced, and has not made a single sound since that I would describe as expressive. Oswin framed the work order and hung it in his office. I told him he was ridiculous. He told me he'd earned it. Fenwick Ola renewed his lease lease for 2 years. So did Orinthia Belk, who I ran into in the hallway last month and who looked, I thought, like a person who was sleeping again. The vacant commercial unit is now a wine bar with a 6-year lease, market rate, run by a woman named Cosette Pham, who has been an absolute neighbor in every sense of the word, and who brings Oswin a bottle of something on the 1st of every month. My apartment, Unit 2C, north-facing windows, I still live in. People ask me why I haven't moved to something bigger. I tell them I like the commute. The truth is, I spent 6 years building something in this city, and I'm not done building yet. And there's something I like about sitting in the room where it all started, where I read that letter at 7:14 in the morning and laughed to myself in a bathrobe. The letter is still in my desk. I kept it. The cream-colored envelope, the blocky handwriting, the number that was supposed to break something in me. I take it out sometimes. Not to gloat. There's no one to gloat to, and that's not the point. I take it out to remember the feeling of holding someone's miscalculation in my hands, the odd tenderness of it, the way it can go so wrong for someone who was so certain. Stellan Drecht sold his remaining properties 18 months ago, and as far as I can tell from public records, has retired to somewhere with better golf weather. I hope, genuinely, that he's okay. I bear him no particular ill will. He was a man who ran out of options and tried to make options by hurting someone he considered smaller than himself, and it didn't work out the way he planned. That's its own kind of justice. The quiet kind. The kind you don't need to explain. The kind that just sits there, folded in a cream-colored envelope, in the desk drawer of an apartment you own.